Slavery may have been legally abolished, but the original Southern white consciousness was not. They still felt a strong urge to control the movement and the behavior of those they called blacks. And what better way to do so than to create laws which reflected a desire to maintain control over the labor and the status of blacks? That's what these black codes were used for, as we'll see in our continued study in Dr. Leon Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. Observe.
Wherever I go, the street, the shop, the house, the hotel, or the steamboat, I hear the people talk in such a way as to indicate that they are yet unable to conceive of the Negro as possessing any rights at all.
He's obviously talking about the whites, who he says couldn't even create the image in their imagination of Negroes having any rights at all, right? It's getting wild in here already. The idea to them was alien and out of this world.
Men who are honorable in their dealings with their white neighbors will cheat a Negro without feeling a single twinge of their honor. To kill a Negro, they do not deem murder. To debauch a Negro woman, they do not think fornication. To take the property away from a Negro, they do not consider robbery.
These were ideas, values, and beliefs within them that influenced the way they behaved. And it's this type of mindset that Europeans developed that allowed them to go around the world conquering and destroying people, right? This was the content that constituted their consciousness. And when coupled with power, that's how you get the type of destruction that they brought around the world. Because without these ideas, they wouldn't have been able to enslave and destroy the people they called blacks in the devastating way they did.
The people boast that when they get freedmen affairs in their own hands, to use their own classic expression, the niggers will catch hell. The reason of all this is simple and manifest. The whites esteemed the blacks their property by natural right.
And they really did believe that was the case. They believed that the Christian God created blacks for the purpose of serving whites, right? This stuff is wild, isn't it? But that's what they believed.
And however much they may admit that the individual relations of masters and slaves have been destroyed by the war and by the President's Emancipation Proclamation, they still have an ingrained feeling that the blacks at large belong to the whites at large. And whenever opportunity serves, they treat the colored people just as their profit, caprice, or passion may dictate.
No doubt some Southern whites might have thought this a crude characterization of their thinking, but nearly every white man and woman readily agreed to the wisdom of restraining and controlling black men and women in ways that were not thought to be necessary for themselves.
The whites seem wholly unable to comprehend that freedom for the Negro means the same thing as freedom for them.
A Northern reporter concluded after his travels in the post-war South.
I did not anywhere find a man who could see that laws should be applicable to all persons alike. And hence, even the best men hold that each state must have a Negro code.
Here we go. And as we talked about before, authentic white consciousness doesn't see other humans as equals. It only sees whites as equals and everyone else as others or little colored people, right? And especially the Negro, who it despises and desires to control the most. That's why they created the Negro Code. Despite a white rhetoric that doomed the freedmen to self-extinction, most planters needed and demanded their labor. And despite all the talk about a childlike race, most whites expected blacks to work and behave like mature adults. Whether he had ever owned slaves or not, almost every white man remained convinced that only rigid controls and compulsion would curtail the natural propensity of blacks toward idleness and vagrancy, induce them to labor for others, and correct their mistaken notions about freedom and working for themselves, claiming an intimate and exclusive knowledge of the Negro's character.
We are the only ones that understand the
The former slaveholder demanded the necessary force to back up the traditional rights of authority over his people, including the punishment of deviant behavior. Without compulsion of some kind, the experiment in free labor could not succeed. It was as simple as that, meaning you had to put some type of force on the blacks to compel them to work, whether it was the whip or something legally enforceable, because without such measure, they apparently would sit idle, right, doing a whole lot of nothing. The self-evident truth which the planter class now imparted to the freed slaves was that they must either work for white folks or starve. That advice differed in no significant way from what federal officials had been telling blacks since the moment of liberation.
When that lesson has been thoroughly learned and inwardly digested,
a Macon newspaper declared,
the Negro may perhaps be of some value.
What lessons? That blacks must work for whites and depend on whites for survival, right? When that lesson was internalized by the freedmen, then they could be of some value. Whatever sympathies Northerners pretended for the Negro, Southern whites assumed they could not object to a principle so universally accepted.
All we want,
a South Carolina planter told a Northern visitor,
is that our Yankee rulers should give us the same privileges with regard to the control of labor which they themselves have.
When pressed for his understanding of Northern labor controls, he indicated that laborers were bound by law to make an annual contract and could be punished for any violations. This is referring to free Negroes signing contracts to work on plantations. If they violated the contract, they could be punished, which was a post-slavery means of controlling their labor. Told that no such laws existed in the North, the planter seemed incredulous.
How do you manage without such laws? How can you get work out of a man unless you compel him in some way?
The visitor replied that
natural laws
sufficed, with the best laborers commanding the best wages. They didn't have contract laws in the North, and the Southerner couldn't believe what he heard, so he said this.
You can't do that way with
The planter immediately retorted. When comparing the two labor systems, some Southern whites insisted, in fact, that this distinction be understood. The presence of the African race made the Southern situation unique and demanded a unique response.
Northern laborers are like other men,
one planter explained, but
Southern laborers are nothing but niggers, and you can't make anything else out of them. They're not controlled by the same motives as white men, and unless you have power to compel them, they'll only work when they can't beg or steal enough to keep from starving.
This was under the thinking that whites were self-motivated and had a natural drive to work and to do more than the basics for living, and that blacks were naturally lazy and needed an external force like the whip to compel them to do more than just to work to survive, right? That's what he's talking about. The idea of apprenticing nearly 4 million ex-slaves to their former masters never received serious consideration, nor did the proposals to distribute the freed blacks equally around the country or to colonize them elsewhere make any sense to planters who desperately needed laborers. Anxious to regain control over their blacks, but not entirely indifferent to Northern reactions, the planter class preferred to establish a docile black labor force in the guise of fulfilling their Christian duties and obligations to those who had once served them so well. Claiming sympathy for their former slaves, they demanded the controls necessary to make them once again happy and prosperous. To control and regulate the freedmen was to advance and protect the best interests of this unfortunate race, to help them restrain their worst passions, to redeem them from certain relapse into semi-barbarism, to save them from inevitable failure, to disabuse their minds of false illusions, and to assist them in finding their proper place in post-war Southern society, which was at the bottom in the pit.
If they cannot, as they never can, occupy the places of legislators, judges, teachers,
a North Carolina planter explained,
they may be useful as tillers of the soil, as handicraftsmen, as servants in various situations, and be happy in their domestic and family relations. It is our Christian duty to encourage them to these ends.
You see how they slid religion in there to give the idea more power? When you add that it's our Christian duty to do this or that, then it amplifies whatever is being suggested, right? Because it makes it seem like a God is supporting it. This is how religion has been used to do both good and bad things. That was putting the best possible face on the legislation adopted by most of the ex-Confederate states to regulate the freedmen, laws that came to be known collectively as the Black Codes. To the white South, the principle seemed altogether clear and fair-minded.
Teach the Negro that if he goes to work, keeps his place, and behaves himself, he will be protected by our white laws.
Although borrowing heavily from antebellum restrictions on free Negroes, as well as from Northern apprenticeship laws and Freedmen's Bureau and War Department regulations, The black codes were still very much a product of post-war Southern thinking, both a legal expression of the lingering paternalism to protect the ex-slave from himself, and a legislative response to immediate and pressing economic problems. While the codes defined the freedman's civil and legal rights, permitting him to marry, hold and sell property, and sue and be sued, the key provisions were those which defined him as an agricultural laborer, barred or circumscribed any alternative occupations, and compelled him to work. That's where the trap came in, to get Negroes to permanently remain in the fields by force. Because at this time, there were still many crops that needed to be worked, and many people were required to work them. So they tried to force Negroes to remain in these occupations.
Upon this point turns the entire question.
A South Carolina newspaper said of the principle of compulsion,
And as that is decided, so is the safety or ruin of this country.
if the codes did not reestablish slavery, as some Northern critics charged, neither did they recognize the former slaves as free men and women, entitled to equal protection under the law. As if to underscore how little had changed, a South Carolina law defined the two parties to a labor contract as servants and masters. Although the laws differed from state to state, the underlying principles and the major provisions remained the same. If found without lawful employment, a freedman could be arrested as a common vagrant, jailed and fined. If unable to pay the fine, he would be hired out to an employer who in turn assumed the financial liability and deducted it from the laborer's wages. And if they couldn't find work, then they most likely couldn't pay the fine, which meant being forced to work back in the fields for the cheap. The Mississippi law also defined as vagrants any blacks unable or unwilling to pay a new tax to support Negro indigents. Indigent means a person who is extremely poor and doesn't have the basic necessities of life. So the Mississippi law defined a vagrant as any black who was unable or unwilling to pay for the support of Negro indigents, while the Alabama Code included as vagrants any runaway stubborn servant or child, and any laborer who loiters away his time or fails to comply with the terms of his employment. Several of the codes also set down the hours of labor, from sunrise to sunset, the duties and the behavior expected of black agricultural workers. With a sliding scale of fines for violations, the Louisiana Code employed the kind of language a master might have once used in his instructions to the overseer.
Bad work shall not be allowed. Failing to obey reasonable orders, neglect of duty, and leaving home without permission will be deemed disobedience. Impudence, swearing, or indecent language to, or in the presence of the employer, his family, or agent, or quarreling and fighting with one another shall be deemed disobedience.
Rather than expedite the slave's transition to freedom or help him to realize his aspirations, the black codes embodied in law the widely held assumption that he existed largely for the purpose of raising crops for a white employer. Although the ex-slave ceased to be the property of a master, he could not aspire to become his own master. No law stated the proposition quite that bluntly, but the provisions breathed that spirit in ways that could hardly be misunderstood. If a freedman decided that agricultural labor was not his special calling, the law often left him with no practical alternative. To discourage those who aspired to be artisans, mechanics, or shopkeepers, or who already held such positions, the South Carolina Code, for example, prohibited a black person from entering any employment except agricultural labor or domestic service, unless he obtained a special license and a certification from a local judge of his skill and fitness and good moral character. They made it to where Negroes had to jump through all types of hoops to get into other occupations. This provision, of course, threatened to undermine the position of the old free Negro class, which had once nearly dominated the skilled trades in places like Charleston. With unconcealed intent, the Mississippi law simply required special licenses of any black wishing to engage in irregular or job work. To discourage freedmen who aspired to raise their own crops, Mississippi barred them from renting or leasing any land outside towns or cities, leaving to local authorities any restrictions they might wish to place on black ownership of real estate. You see that? By adopting harsh vagrancy laws and restricting non-agricultural employment, the white South clearly intended to stem the much feared drift of freedmen toward the cities and to underscore their status as landless agricultural laborers, even as Mississippi forbade them to lease lands outside towns or cities. Local ordinances there and in neighboring Louisiana made black residency within the towns or cities virtually intolerable, if not impossible. The ordinance adopted in Opelousas, Louisiana, deservedly served as a model and inspiration for other communities. To enter the town, a black person needed his employer's permission, stipulating the object of the visit and the time necessary to accomplish it. Any freedman found on the streets after 10 o'clock at night without a written pass or permit from his employer would be subject to arrest and imprisonment. No freedman could rent or keep a house within the town limits under any circumstances, or reside within the town unless employed by a white person who assumed responsibility for his conduct. Oh, snaps! To hold any public meetings, or to assemble in large numbers for any reason, blacks needed the mayor's permission, as they also did to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to black congregations. Nor could they possess weapons or sell, barter, or exchange any kind of merchandise without special permits. A freedman found violating these ordinances could be punished by imprisonment, fines, and forced labor on the city streets. While finding the ordinances
incompatible with freedom,
the black newspaper in New Orleans noted that freedmen could walk the streets up to 10 o'clock at night, 1 hour later than under slavery.
This additional hour is the fruit of our victories in the field,
the editor declared.
4 years of a bloody war have been fought to gain that 1 hour. The world certainly moves in that quarter.
With the adoption of the black codes, the place of the ex-slave in post-war Southern society had been fixed in law, his mobility checked, his bargaining power sharply reduced, and his rights of appeal hedged with difficulties. Any freedman who refused to work at the prevailing wage in a particular area could be defined as a vagrant, and there was little to protect him from combinations of the employers setting wages and conditions. To many in the North, the code smacked of the old bondage, and even some Southern whites thought them ill-advised, impractical, or at least badly timed.
We showed our hand too soon.
A Mississippi planter conceded.
We ought to have waited till the troops were withdrawn and our representatives admitted to Congress. Then we could have had everything our own way.
The black codes proved to be short-lived, largely because the South had moved precipitately, impetuously, and carelessly. So the black codes didn't last that long, only less than about 2 years, right? But what it showed was that whites in the South had not given up on trying to control blacks. They tried whatever they could, but nothing worked because the cosmic energy was against them, and it came through sweeping and making the times change, right? When that happens, people can try all they want, and nothing is going to work. No praying or anything. It's not going to work when it comes through sweeping, right? And that's what they discovered. Although federal officials, both in the Freedmen's Bureau and the Union Army, had implemented labor policies which were strikingly similar, the codes were deemed too blatantly discriminatory and overly repressive. Not long after the codes were adopted, federal officials ordered many of them suspended, nearly always on the grounds that freedmen should be subject to the same regulations, penalties, punishments, and courts as whites. So there was a different consciousness manifested in some of the other whites who ultimately became one of the tools in tearing apart the system of white supremacy, right? All the things they assisted in, like getting rid of slavery and providing rights to blacks, were contributions to destroying white supremacy. And it has been going downhill ever since, right? It already reached its peak before the Civil War. And from there on, it has been going downhill, right? It's still alive today, but it's so weak that it's on this last leg as we continue moving into these new eras. Several of the state legislatures, too, had second thoughts about their actions, particularly after the initial insurrection panic subsided and the labor situation improved. The legislators themselves repealed or revised some of the more obnoxious clauses, and the codes passed by a number of states in 1866 proved less harsh. If the codes were dead, the sentiment which had created them was still very much alive. Whether enforced, set aside, or amended, the black codes had revealed how the ruling class expected to perpetuate that rule. So that's a little bit on the short-lived black codes. They tried to create a modified slavery using slick legal tactics, but they were found out and the plan was destroyed. And although the black codes didn't really work out, they still never gave up in their struggle to keep authentic white consciousness alive and white superiority alive and the status of whiteness alive. But when it's going downhill, there's nothing that can be done about it, right? When the energy is against you and the time is moving forward, you can try to sustain it all you want, but ultimately the cosmic hand prevails. And when it says it's over with, right? This is what they discovered. And so with that being said, hopefully you have enjoyed this commentary. I thank you for your time and for your participation. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.